We'll get cracking then, guys. So yeah, welcome to the Hive, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. So yeah, for those of you who are new with us today, we'll go through brief intros in a second, just brief intro into myself, into Amanda, Olivia, and Prodo as an agency supplier of the space as well. And then, yeah, if you wouldn't mind, we do record these and sort of post them afterwards. So it'd be great if when Amanda's running through the content today, we could stay on mute for now, but absolutely, please feel free to use the chat pane, and then at the end, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session as well. We've had a number of questions through as part of the registration process as well, so we'll be addressing those. But if anyone's got any further throughout, pop them in the chat pane, and then we can even come off mute and sort of have an open discussion towards the end as well. But then, yeah, we'll get through the main topic of today, which, as I say, is navigating the regulatory landscape in social housing. As we know, the consumer regs are coming in, and that's quite a significant change. And then Q&A towards the end. But yeah, just to begin with, good morning. My name's Jacob. I'm head of sales here at Prodo. I've been here for 6 years or so, and worked really closely with Prodo's social housing clients throughout that time. So a big part of my role is speaking to people and organisations, hearing challenges, and then putting forward potential solutions, whether that be digital solutions, consultancy, or helping to alleviate those challenges in some way across the housing sector. But yeah, as an agency, we've been around for over 20 years, working with housing associations throughout that time. And as you can imagine, our sort of product and offering has sort of evolved as the sector's evolved throughout that time as well. And we're very much now focusing on helping housing associations to build trust with residents. We hear that is something which lots of our clients are looking to address during the sort of the workshops that we run, with the ultimate aim of sort of creating that transparent engagement, freeing up internal capacity to spend that capacity with the people who need your support most, ultimately transforming that customer experience. So that's kind of where we fit into the sector, and where I fit into Prodo. Liv, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello introduction, and then we'll move on to introducing our guest Amanda as well.
Yeah, hi, I'm Liv. I'm an account director here at Prodo, so I'm working with many clients. And of course, as you can imagine, this topic in particular is a big talking point amongst clients at the moment. So really excited for this session and to hear from Amanda. Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Liv. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think I know some of you already, so forgive me if I'm repeating in terms of background, but just to tell you a little bit about me, first of all, I've been an exec director for about 28 years, showing my age now. My headshot is younger than my age, and during that 28 years as an exec director, I spent about 15 years in the commercial sector. I was a director for Sainsbury's, for Compass Group, who are the world's largest contract caterer in about 92 countries, Granada PLC, who are one of the ITV telly companies, and also latterly, prior to setting up my own business, I worked for a private equity-backed food travel organisation that worked across 32 countries. And during that time, I've seen loads of different cultures, loads of different sectors, and in the last 15 years I've worked pretty much in housing. So in the housing sector, I was a commercial director for a couple of G15 organisations in London. I led the merger of Clarion. Clarion's often in the news, and you'll see lots of challenges that Clarion have had, being the scale that they are, along with other larger organisations. So I did actually lead on that merger, which was quite challenging because we were putting together 8 separate operating organisations that were part of Circle Housing, and joining them with Affinity Sutton to create Clarion Group. I was also the commercial director for Housemarque, so I really care about all things data. And I still work with Housemarque. I produce their monthly Pulse report along with Jonathan Cox, their data director. And I am associate director at Prodo. So I thought the other bit that's a bit more interesting, rather than just reeling off a load of organisations I've worked for, I wanted to share what I'm really passionate about. And I would describe these as my obsessions. So I'm obsessed with creating capacity. You know, there is no landlord in the land that can do absolutely everything that needs doing. There is not enough money in the system. There aren't enough resources. So anything that creates capacity is a real passion of mine. The second passion is around good quality relationships and communication. Really building trust, really connecting with stakeholders, connecting with customers, and connecting with colleagues, because I think through those good quality conversations and interaction comes excellent customer service, which is my third real obsession. And you can't crack customer experience until you know your customers. You need to understand their needs and preferences. You need to create services that meet those needs and preferences. And there is no silver bullet to how you service a customer. So you might expect me to say digital all the way, let's get 100% of people digital, as I'm here today representing Prodo. But actually at Prodo, we don't believe that. What we believe is you need to understand your customers, and then you need to be clear that the way you manage those customers and interact with them meets their needs and preferences. We do believe there's a lot of untapped potential in digital, but we do think you need to create capacity for people who are digitally excluded, whether that be through generation, through poverty, or through access. So we're kind of forgetting this whole lingo about digital by default. That's not something that you'll hear us banging on about. So obviously, I'm opening up talking about digital, but those three passions of mine are really aligned to consumer regulation, and we're going to come on to talk about consumer regulation in context, because I could have a load of slides here that just tell you everything about consumer regulation, but actually you can all read. So you can click on, you can constantly on LinkedIn at the moment, or even, on the government websites, etc. You could read all the blurb on it. So what I'm going to try and do is set it in the context of the challenges that landlords are facing. And if you strip it back, let's just strip it back for a minute. We will come on to talk about the new style of IDAs and what consumer regulation means in practice, and what we can expect. But actually, if you strip it back, it's around having transparent communication. It's around knowing your customers. It's around knowing your stock. It's around having really robust business plans and robust decision making that's informed by data as you make those trade-off decisions that are really essential to complying with consumer regulation. And it's about offering customers, tenants, residents the right experience for their needs, and an experience that you can deliver on given your capacity. So if we just move on then, Jake, I just want to cover, Jake's doing the slides for me, so forgive me going next slide, Jake, every 2 minutes. Let's just step back a minute and say, okay, consumer regulation's coming. It's the biggest regulatory change we've seen for over a decade. We've those of us who've been around in the sector for a while will in particular remember 2010 and the austerity years. That was significant change, really different way of doing things, the rent cut, all of that. But this is really the biggest change that we've seen in regulation for over a decade. And as you can see in the top right, that's just one of the blocks. So we're here today talking about one thing that's completely massive, and it is only one thing of all of the things on this slide. So we're not out of the cost of living crisis. Everybody's still facing real challenges, fuel poverty, escalating prices. Although it's leveling out a bit and things are coming down, it's still pretty challenging. Supply chain costs are as high as they've ever been, and we've also got supply chain scarcity. The war in Ukraine, Brexit, they've all had impacts on supply chain, and that's all impacting on our ability to do more with less. We've got reduced revenue in real terms from last year, given the rent cap. So in real terms last year, prices went up and rents went down. So again, that's reduced revenue, less cash to do things. The cost of borrowing is higher. So unless people had locked in rates, which some organisations have, early on, prior to the economic crisis, the cost of borrowing is pretty high at the moment. Decarbonisation, we know, we've got a while to get there to where we need to go, but given where we're at with stock condition currently, given the timeline, that's still a really big challenge. Building safety is still a big challenge, and particularly those organisations in urban locations with a high density of high rise, that's even more challenging. Competing demands for asset investment. You know, what do? Do you work on your retrofit, or do you tactically fix damp and mold? You know, do you address your safety issues, which you have to address first, but then that swallows up a large proportion of your capital, and then you're behind with your decarbonisation. So this whole balance of asset investment is really challenging. And what the regulator's really looking for in that asset investment space is, do you know your stock? You know, do you have live information about your stock? Is your stock being updated as you go along, as you're conducting repairs? Are you responding adequately? You know, that whole dilemma in the asset space, you know, it's really difficult to have the capacity to do everything. So the regulator's looking for really sensible decision making. They want to see boards making those trade-off decisions, and making the trade-off decisions that help deliver the long-term business plan as well as the immediate business plan. And of course, decency and stock condition. I deliberately use that rather than damp and mold, because I think one of the things that the sector is very good at is reacting, and it's less good at being really proactive and looking long-term at investment. You can see that if you look at the regulator's last quarterly report, if you look at the sector's risk profile, if you look at the latest accounts and VFM metrics that have been published, what you'll see is a massive increase in spend in responsive repairs. That's driving the cost per property. So asset spend is higher than it's been for a number, I think up to about 10 years, actually, the levels of spend. So if we just focus on damp and mold and don't look at the whole asset, we're just going to keep going back and repeating, going back and repairing a bit more and then a bit more. So then the overall investment in that property is substantial. So I deliberately am focused on decency and stock condition rather than just damp and mold. But of course, damp and mold is an important part of that. And we'll be touching on that later when we talk about the regulation that's relevant to that. So, okay, thanks, Jake.
No worries. Yeah, I was just going to touch upon that, because all of those things that we tend to hear about quite a lot, don't we, with our clients and people we speak with in the space, and you can see it in the data, can't you, in terms of those reports that you referred to, but also all of these things sort of leading towards that quite sort of stark reduction in the interest cover sort of cushion, if you like, which does sort of feed into what you're talking about around having to have that sort of laser focus on not only that customer experience piece, but creating the capacity to be able to do more with less, certainly with that sort of interest cover being a lot lower and sort of cost rising in those different areas. So yeah, that's a really interesting summary.
Yeah, and I think as well, I mean, what's interesting, Jake, about that is if you think about it, that whole home approach to asset management, so your asset investment strategy, taking that long-term view. That's not to say that I'm suggesting that you should have cases of damp and mold you're not addressing. I mean, you know, the regulator and central government have been very clear. They've written to landlords directly about what's expected. So of course, you've got to react to that immediately, but you have also got to take that step back and really look at that long-term asset investment strategy, because there's two things that it creates if you don't. The first one I mentioned earlier, which is that you're going back to the same property over and over again with these long-term decency and stock condition issues. So it's obviously not cost effective. But the second thing it drives, and I'll share some stats later, is it drives a lot of contact through the contact centre, and it drives a lot of complaints. Now, we know that contact centre volumes are up. We know that complaints are up. We know that ombudsman maladministration claims are up. So all of those things create more drain on already stretched resources. So it's not just a sensible asset investment strategy, it's also a sensible strategy for creating capacity and managing the customer experience really effectively. So if we go on to the next slide then, Jake, 'cause I'm conscious I'm taking a while over some of these slides. Right. So let's just think about, everybody knows that there's all these moles to whack. Have you seen the game at the fair where you kind of whack the mole and it pops its head up and then you whack it again? Now, I've seen lots of examples of landlords trying to do that. You know, I'm going to deal with this problem over here, but then suddenly another mole's popping up elsewhere. Here's all the moles that we're having to whack at the moment, and you know, you may know more, but you know, we've got housing ombudsman cases, maladministration cases are through the roof. Not surprising, because we've got you know, in the last couple of years we've had a new ombudsman, with additional powers, additional teeth, and a very good PR machine, actually. I know Richard Blakeway, and he is very, very balanced. What the Ombudsman pushes out is pretty balanced. They show good practice examples as well, but they're not afraid of showing where it goes wrong. We're having to get ready for these new inspection style IDAs, you know, call them what you will. Some people call them inspection styles, some people don't. But the reality is that those new IDAs are quite different. And again, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. We've got vacancies, we've got high absence levels. There's actually people leaving housing as a career because of the pressure of having to do more with less and feeling permanently overwhelmed. Damp and mould we've talked about. Complaints we know are at an all-time high, and satisfaction with complaints. Housemart ran a mid-year look at the TSMs, some of you will have seen that, and satisfaction with complaints is down at 34%, so really, really low. We're seeing these people leave the sector, as we said earlier. Media coverage is really heightened. Every day you're clicking on the link, aren't you? Whether it's Inside Housing or Housing Digital or Housing Today, and you're seeing the same kind of stories over and over again. Contact centre call volumes are again the highest that they've been, and we know that people are calling 2 or 3 times about the same complaint. We've got misaligned technology. You know, we've got years ago, we have these big, giant technical transformation programs, and some of them are not really delivering what was promised at the outset. And so what we're trying to do is, over the years, we've been bolting in solutions, and it can end up being quite misaligned. And, you know, I've got some tips for that later. Some of you may have cracked that and got it right, but I've got some tips for how you can think about aligning the technology. And then finally, we've got this digital immaturity. Now, as I said, I'm not saying digital immaturity because I'm here as a digital company. I'm saying digital immaturity is an issue because it's not freeing up the capacity for the people who want to do business through digital channels to deal with those people who can't or who don't want to. So I think there's that balance between ensuring that we have a greater digital maturity and also servicing the needs of those people who aren't digital. And a good example of that is, it sat for years, proportion of calls that were made through digital channels, or inquiries or complaints through digital channels, sat for ages at around the 25% mark. It then moved up to sit at around a third. And of course, we saw this skyrocket during the pandemic, because we really got to know our customers, and, you know, we were all sat at home reaching out to them, talking to them, understanding their needs and preferences. But it's gradually kind of drifted back, and the average now still only sits at just over a third. You know, and we'll talk about some of the ups and downs of digital as a channel a bit later. So thanks, Jake. On to the next slide. So in a nutshell, trust is at an all-time low. We know what government's perception is. You know, there's been plenty of noise about that. The Secretary for State has written to landlords on more than one occasion outlining concerns. Tenants are making it clear they don't feel heard. The sector narrative, the policymakers, the influencers, the medias, it's all the same type of story. We've talked about the Housing Ombudsman, and there is some evidence that in some places we are repeating the same mistakes. And then there is this disjointed ownership and transparency of complaints, and all of those things are compounding with to give us a position where trust really is at an all-time low. Thanks, Jake. If you go on to the next slide. So data tells a sobering story. Contact centres are in crisis. You know, we're seeing absence levels high, we're seeing staffing levels challenging as people leave. Call volumes are up. And as we said, the staffing levels are down in real terms. Void turnaround, we've still got a lag. You know, everyone's kind of forgotten about the pandemic now, and we're talking about consumer regulation and what's next, and cost of living crisis. But we've still got some areas where we are feeling a pandemic recovery lag. And that is challenging in the voids and letting area. The TSM prep, you know, I mentioned earlier the 6-month look at the TSMs. We did initially, when everybody galvanised around consumer regulation, see a very slight uptick in satisfaction, but that has failed to materialise as a long-term trend. So the TSM, the satisfaction levels that we're seeing aren't anywhere near where they need to be. And I mentioned earlier about the contact centre channel through digital channels. And then repair spend, everyone's talking about investment and how much we're spending on repairs, and we're seeing the cost per property go up. But some of that is reflected by higher costs, not an enhanced programme. And it's really important that you understand that, you know, what's about improving the fabric of the building and investing more in real terms, and what's about just the fact that the materials and labour have gone up in price, so that balance. So it is a really sobering story. I promise I won't be doom and gloom for the whole presentation, but I do think to talk about consumer regulation, you really have to set the context first. So thanks, Jake. On to the next.
It gives you that sort of context in terms of what it's attempting to do, I suppose, doesn't it? And obviously there's a lot to go out with it, which we'll come on to shortly, but it does give you that sort of indication in terms of what they're in place for, and therefore how they'll be measured sort of moving forwards, I guess.
Yeah. So the three big issues are not enough capacity to deliver what we need, customer trust is at an all-time low, and it's hard to transform customer experience with data and digital maturity levels being where they are. So they're the three really big issues as we go into this new era of consumer regulation. Thanks, Jake. Next slide. So I just want to quash a few digital myths first, before we kind of dive into the meat of what the standards are saying and what they're asking us to do. So at Prodo, we don't believe in digital by default, you know, and you know what? Commercially, it'd be better for us if we did, wouldn't it? If everybody in the sector were digital and they had 100% of customers on our platform. But you know what? We don't actually think that's right. We think it's about having digital as a channel of choice, and that's our philosophy. We don't believe that digital is a faceless system. We believe it's around interactive engagement. We believe it's around being transparent, which again, I'll come on to because it is one of the consumer regulation. And there is some evidence that people who force digital by default actually have seen drops in satisfaction. We want to see a seamless customer experience. We don't want this disparate customer contact where somebody calls a contact centre, it gets passed on to somebody else. Then there's a part of the problem that's specialist, so it goes out to a contractor. Then the contractor bit is being dealt with differently to the bit that's being dealt with by the in-house DLO. And before you know it, you can't actually see that one view of that customer and that challenge that they're facing. You can start to use digital to get ready for regulation because you've got that integrated audit trail. You can demonstrate you know your customers because they're there, they're on a platform. You can demonstrate to the Ombudsman how you're handling the complaint, where it's up to, because that's all in the system and all visible. And more powerfully, the customer and yourself see the same. So you could be speaking to a customer and you're both looking at the same view. Ownership and accountability is really key, not this, oh, I've called the contact centre and they've told me it's stuck with a surveyor or it's stuck with the external contractor. From pressing send and hoping for the best to live tracking and total visibility. I've been doing some work with quite a few different tenant groups, and the most overriding piece of feedback, if I have to pick one thing in the last 5 years of working with tenant groups that I've received, is that I raise an issue and it goes into a black hole. If there was one piece of feedback I have to say that I'd heard the most repetitively in the last 5 years about customer experience, that would be it. I press send and I hope for the best, and I have no clue what's happening. And then I pick up the phone and I'm sat on hold for ages, and then the person I speak to can't answer all of my questions, they can only answer 2 of them. So, you know, that real live tracking and total visibility is essential for knowing your customers and delivering an effective service. And from being digitally excluded to having someone there to meet needs and preferences. Now, those of you who've worked in the sector for a long time, I don't know how long all of you have worked in the sector, but those of you who have for a long time will remember the days when there was lots of door knocking and treading the pavements and really being out and about. And over time, that has eroded a bit, and we are seeing moves now to that happening again. Now, there is no question, pounding the beat, knocking on doors, you know, having coffees with people in community centres, etc., is expensive. It's labour intensive and it requires investment. So what we're saying is if you could create the capacity to really understand your customers, to understand their needs and preferences, to unlock digital where digital works, that creates that cash to do that. And we've got an example of a client who's done that and created 19 FTEs. And you know what? They haven't saved that money. They haven't gone, great, let's bank that to surplus. They've reinvested that into frontline services. And at a time when resources are so stretched, that's really powerful. And this is my final point, really, that blunt efficiency tool. It's not about blunt efficiency. It's about capacity creation. Thanks, Jake. On to the next slide. Yeah. So consumer regulation, we've said it's the biggest regulatory change for a decade. So let's flick over, Jake, to the next one. And this is the timeline of how we got here. So November 2020, the government published the Charter for Social Housing and the Resident Social Housing White Paper. Now, that publication of that paper followed a ton of work that happened post-Grenfell. I was lucky enough to lead the first tenant and landlord and consultation workshop in the east of England with the Cabinet Office and the then Housing Minister, Alok Sharma. Now, we've had obviously about 105 housing ministers since then. As you all know, if you've worked in housing a while, we like to change housing ministers pretty frequently. But actually, this was the first large-scale consultation piece of legislation. We always consult on everything, but it's usually, oh, click on this and give us your feedback. This was going around the length and breadth of the country, some of you may have been involved in it, talking to groups of tenants, talking to landlords and going, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to make sure a Grenfell never happens again? And that exercise delivered the social housing white paper. We were then obviously invited to give views. We then had the final consumer standards, along with a summary of views through consultation. And we then, in April 2024, which is obviously imminent now, the consumer standards will come into force. So the first thing you learn about that timeline is, gosh, it takes forever, doesn't it, to get from kind of having a conversation through to actually having revised legislation. But actually, it has been extensively consulted on, and lots of people have had an input into that. So if we go on to the next slide, Jake, we start to see some of the meat. So landlords are accountable for providing the tenants with good quality homes and services. They have to prioritise tenants' safety. They have to treat tenants with respect, and they have to be open and honest with tenants. So that's the kind of the philosophy. That's the philosophy of what landlords are accountable for. And obviously there's a ton of stuff that goes underneath that. And along with that is the Charter, and the Charter for Social Housing Residents outlines exactly what every social housing resident should be able to expect. So that has to be your starting point for looking at your readiness. You know, can you hand on heart say that we could come out and talk to every single one of your tenants, or at least the lion's share of your tenants, and ask those questions? And when we know the answer to those questions, we know that we are starting to comply with the Charter. So I'll just leave this on a couple of seconds. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but you know, you can see just a bit more detail of, you know, knowing how the landlord's performing. And this includes things like details on repairs and complaints, how the money's spent, so that the landlord can be held to account. You can see a lot of focus here around complaints, which was why the Ombudsman was strengthened prior to consumer regulation, so that that service can be up and running. And you'll also know, obviously, that the regulator is also significantly investing in additional resources to regulate the new standards, the new Charter and consumer regulation. And you'll feel that as another capacity drain as well, because obviously the people who are paying for that are the providers. Okay, so on to the next one then, Jake. So consumer regulation and practice. Now, you know, rather than have a slide on all of the meat behind consumer regulation, because I thought it'd be much better to have a debate around it, I've tried to kind of summarise those big ticket headlines. So there's 4 new consumer standards, which we'll come on to in a moment. There is a new inspection style IDA process. Now, the difference in regulation in kind of jargon terms is we are currently being, until April, economically regulated, and we'll be moving to a regime of consumer regulation in April 2024. Now, economic regulation checks that organisations are well governed and that they're financially viable. In shorthand, clearly there's a lot that goes into that, but in a nutshell, that's what happens. And so the IDAs that people were having were checking the boards were functioning correctly, we're checking that, we've got the right policies and procedures in place, that, the decision-making sound, that the business plan's properly funded, and that we're managing the business effectively. The new style of inspection will do much greater focus on triangulating some of that to ensure that we're meeting those standards, which I'll come on to in a moment, and we're living by that charter and the promises that are made in that charter and in the social housing white paper. So an example would be, let's say I'm the regulator, and I'm interviewing some board members, as I would have done in the old IDA, and I'm asking about something quite specific, and I'm saying, how do you know that you're focusing your asset spend in the right areas, and how do you know that you're really capturing those cases of damp and mould and decency? And everybody gets really prepared for their IDA, and I'm sure the board member will go, absolutely, I know because of this, and this, and it's scrutinised at board, and we have this report that comes out every month and shows us about the damp and mould. Now, that assurance would have been sought from a combination of desktop information, so complaints would have been looked at, lots of other information that's kept at the landlord, and a series of interviews. What will now happen in the new style inspection process is we might be asked a question, how are your residents informing how you maintain decency, and how do you know that you're on top of those, let's stick to the same question, those damp and mould examples. And then not only will they take the answer from the board member and the desktop information, they'll go and talk to tenants. They'll ask tenants. They'll then look at the next 2 months of board papers and want to see that what's in those board papers has been informed by what tenants told them. They'll want to see that you're capturing that insight and that data and not just mechanically reporting it, but actually using it to run the organisation so that you can demonstrate that you're meeting those standards. So we'll come on to the standards in a moment. There's also enhanced enforcement powers. So, strengthen consequences as well. The regulator can come in 48 hours notice. One of the old tests was something called serious detriment. If a tenant was in danger of suffering serious detriment under the old regulatory regime, then the regulator could obviously take action, take enforcement action, downgrade. Of course, downgrades existed pre-consumer regulation, but these enhanced powers are much stronger, and the enforcement's much stronger. Bigger fines, shorter notice, much more far-reaching, in the same way as we've seen with the Ombudsman and their strengthened regime in the last 2 years. There is a larger, well-resourced regulator. So there is the firepower to come and regulate effectively to this new enhanced consumer regime. The Housing Ombudsman is well established, and as we've said, that's quite a high-profile regime. Political expectations are in writing. The Secretary of State writes to landlords, writes to CEOs and says, this is what I'm expecting of you. This is absolutely quite clearly what I'm expecting. So again, those political expectations are also in writing. And then we have decency, Decent Home 2, Awab's Law, activism and media backdrop, and customer voice led. So there is increasingly activists across the sector who are saying, you know what, actually my landlord isn't getting that right, and I'm going to go out there and bang the drum. And so we're getting that happening as well. So all of that is coming together to give us this consumer regulation landscape. Okay, so on to the next slide, Jake. We've got the 4 new consumer standards. So the consumer standards are around safety and quality. They are around transparency, influence and accountability. They are around neighbourhood and community, and they are around tenancy. So it's really important that you understand those standards. And I would suggest that, if you're in organisations where everybody isn't familiar with those standards, then they need to get familiar with them. This isn't just about the governance department or the tenancy team or housing management knowing the standards. This is about ensuring that you can demonstrate that your organisation does all of these things, lives by that charter in every single thing that happens. So, you know, transparency, influence, and accountability. It's about tenants knowing exactly where they stand. It's about them having a meaningful influence, and it's about them holding their landlord to account for service quality. You know, that's probably one of those biggest areas of the regulatory standards, because we've probably got the furthest to go, because we don't even 100% know all of our tenants and customers. Some organisations are further forward than others. But remember, consumer regulation is relevant to local authorities as well as housing associations, and so everybody's at a slightly different stage of that journey. So Jake, if you want to go on to the next slide. Thank you. So I did talk a little bit about how we could overcome some of those barriers earlier. And I just want to give you some of these tips before we kind of wrap up and pause for questions and discussion. Because the first point is you've got to align your technology roadmap to your customer experience and your customer needs. If you've got a technology roadmap that has an asset project here and a customer experience project there and an HR system over here, there's nothing wrong with having different systems and having best-in-class systems. You don't all have to be on one giant integrated system, but it's really important that that technology roadmap is aligned to what your customers need and want. And again, that's a really important part of regulation. You've got to be able to demonstrate that. You know, it won't be seen as acceptable to be investing loads of money in technology that isn't aligned to delivering those needs. And if you don't have your technology aligned on a technology roadmap, then you'll probably be investing in a way that doesn't meet customers' needs. I would kind of stake my reputation and career on that. You've got to get stuck into the heavy lifting. It's not too late. I don't want anyone panicking if you think, oh my goodness, I'm behind. You know, we ran recently, just before the end of the year, around end of October, November time, we ran a survey and a really large percentage of landlords told us they weren't ready yet. But get stuck into that heavy lifting. Make sure you've got good baseline data. Make sure you understand customer sentiment. And you know what? If you haven't done that heavy lifting yet, don't worry. Pull together some groups of people who and tenants who can give you a bit of a flavour of where they're at and what they think those needs are, and then you can actually triangulate some of that against the data that you've got. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Let's say your complaints, and I can't tell you the amount of boardrooms and exec team tables that I've sat around where everyone goes, oh yeah, well, I know our complaints say this, but you know what, the data quality is not right, and we're not comparing apples with apples and apples and pears and all of this. And all that we're really doing is making excuses. What we should be saying is, okay, the data's telling me this. It might not be 100% accurate yet, and I'm working on that. But also, what's my gut telling me? Because your gut will also tell you. Your gut will also tell you. So, you know what, if your complaints, satisfaction with complaints is pretty low, you have to ask yourself, do I think my tenants are satisfied with how we handle complaints or not? And if your gut's telling you that, whether you're apples and pears or apples and apples, it's probably right. And then you can get stuck into doing something with that. Make sure that your structures and roles align to your customer experience aspiration. New consumer regulation and those 4 standards require different things. If you've still got a structure you've had for 10 years, it probably won't deliver what you need. You need to ask yourself whether you've got the right people as well. And you've also got to get all departments aligned to that vision. Every technology director needs to understand consumer regulation. That's how can a technology director possibly put the right solution in place? You know, how can a finance director write the right strategy and business plan if they don't understand this? So all of those departments have to be aligned to the vision. And you need to really accelerate that consumer regulation readiness, you know, that transparency, that accountability, that influence, that tenancy, and all of those standards, and use that lever to get boards and senior teams listening. Because the one thing I know, when you're in front of boards and you're presenting to boards, you know, they want to know that we're complying with consumer regulation. You know, they're going to get asked the question at the IDA, they could get downgraded, they're accountable for that. And like I said, use those best practice examples to demonstrate those gains. You know, I use one of a client we've worked with at Prodo who'd gained 19 FTEs. So don't be scared by how big it is. Just start to pick them off one by one by one. Thanks, Jake. And I think, is there just one more summary slide before Q&A?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that was my big three at the start, if you remember: the building trust, transforming CX, and unlocking capacity. So I know I rattled through those, but I was conscious Jake told me to allow plenty of time for questions. So thank you.
That's great, Amanda. Thank you very much for that. Really, really insightful and thorough overview of the landscape, really, where this has sort of come from, and also some tips and tricks in terms of where to sort of start to look to begin addressing this. I know we have had a number of questions through the form as part of the sort of registration process for today, and if anyone has got any further, please put them in the chat pane. But just to begin on that, just looping back to a couple of the points you made. So we kind of touched on the change being driven by obviously sort of customer need, but also the fact that we're changing from economic sort of regulation to consumer based. And the fact that quite often, well, we know, don't we, that the sector typically is good at responding to things. We've seen that with the sort of the output of the Grenfell incident, and also the incident that led to sort of Awab's law come into place for damp and mold and things. But in terms of like how to plan for becoming more proactive, for me, it feels like a lot of this comes down to the data which housing associations hold on customers in stock. And I suppose some of the points you made a little bit earlier around technology being misaligned and ultimately leading to people in the contact centre and things having a bit of a more difficult job to do to support these sorts of things. So if you got examples of where you've seen organisations sort of look to address this in a way that is becoming more sort of proactive with regards to sort of planning for it from a data perspective, would you say?
Yeah, I think the key is, the way I would describe it is, it's like jumping on a train that's already moving. If you just react and hope for the best, it's not going to work. Yeah. But equally, if you go, I'm going to spend the next 3 years getting my data quality right, that isn't going to work either. Because you literally are going to be caught out because you're still waiting for this perfect world. So what you need to do is, you need to start living and breathing the philosophy of consumer regulation. You need to free up capacity. I'd say there isn't a bigger priority than freeing up capacity, because, as I said at the start, we know that capacity is seriously stretched. So if you can free up some capacity and you can continue to work with customers, to define that service, to understand their needs and preferences, you can work on your data quality in parallel. I mean, a good example would be a Prodo one, actually, where, we've put our platform, so we've put our portal, our self-service portal, into organisations where they say, right, we know X% of customers want to serve digitally because they're busy, they don't want to sit on the phone, so that's great. So we put the portal in. We've created the capacity. The example that we used was one, a client that's, created 19 FTEs. But then through those 19 FTEs, you need to be really thoughtful about how you invest. So if you invest them in improving data quality, working on understanding baseline needs, running focus groups to understand customers' needs and preferences, you're still delivering your service. Everybody's familiar with consumer regulation, and you're improving your data quality as you go along. Because if you wait to get your data quality perfect, you'll be too late. You'll have had 2 years of non-compliance. So I think you've got to do both, and creating the capacity gives you the people to do both.
Completely agree. It's a really good point. It's often something which we hear, isn't it, when we start talking about planning some sort of digital product implementation, even just as an example from our perspective. It is usually the case that it's like, okay, that sounds really good and we know there's benefits there, but actually internally we need to get this done first. We need to align these things first. We need to get our data out first, when in reality just taking that action to begin with and sort of starting to make that change is better than waiting for that perfect scenario, which probably is, as you put it, years away.
It's a bit like chicken and egg, isn't it? Which came first? Yeah,
exactly that. Yeah. Have we had any questions through the chat, Liv, or the ones that you wanted to address from the form submissions at all?
Yeah, so we've had a few that we got ahead of the session. Just before I do that, I think it was really interesting, Amanda, what you said about every kind of digital professional, especially living and breathing the standards, because I think that's a conversation that we're having quite regularly. We want to do X, Y, and Z. This is the roadmap. How does it align to kind of the standards? Is that investment kind of working towards those standards in the way that we would expect? So I thought that was a really interesting point. Thank you for that. So we had one, obviously there are a lot of aspects to consider, and having to do more with less. Have you seen any examples of housing associations investing budget into specific areas in preparation for regulatory changes and already seeing any positive changes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, the first thing I would say about investment is if you look at the annual VFM submissions and obviously look at spend data as well and where money's being spent, the three biggest areas of increased spend this year that are driving up overhead, other than obviously asset management, because we know that the cost per property of repairs has gone up. It's on regulation readiness, it's on change, and it's on consultants. So there is this evidence that the sector is really investing in getting ready. And the areas where I've seen the biggest impact are where people do things that strengthen their understanding of stock condition and customers, and also free up capacity. Because those three things, you know, that really understanding your customers enables you to design service effectively. Really understanding your stock condition and your asset base helps you to prioritise asset investment, which is, of course, the biggest spend for a housing association. And then the third area is around making sure that then that data is used to design services. So I promise I'm not just saying this because it's a Prodo call, but those organisations that have done that understanding first and then use digital to unlock that capacity for the people who want digital, I have seen the best results, because I've seen the best results in terms of you know, understanding customers' needs and preferences, but I've also seen the best results in terms of capacity creation, because you can then create that capacity to deal with customers' access needs. So, for example, you know, do you know what the access needs are of every single customer? Because you absolutely have to know that. And we're not just talking about language. You know, we're talking about, you know, do people need a screen reader? Do people need something in large print? You know, are people at home with a vulnerability like coercive control, and therefore, you know, their mail gets opened by somebody else? They're the kind of things when we talk about knowing customers' needs and preferences that will actually make the bigger difference. So there is no substitution. So where I've seen the best win is where we've created capacity through digital to then go and pound the streets and really get to know customers, run focus groups and understand customers to make sure that service design is designed in a way to meet those needs, because that will also then help with compliance with consumer regulation. And also the other one I would say is some work around understanding of consumer regulation, making sure that, you know, boards can make trade-off decisions and work with data. So that's the other big area I've seen readiness enhanced, where there's work being done with boards. But there is evidence that the sector's really spending in those three areas.
That's great, thank you. Another question that we had was, how is the success of these changes going to be measured, and will this be the regulator or the housing ombudsman auditing directly off the back of it?
I mean, I would say it's one of those things of all of the above. So if we think about it, you know, if I was giving you the textbook answer, I would be saying it will be measured through, you know, housing ombudsman code and maladministration claims. It will be measured, of course, through the new style of IDA. So every landlord will be assessed by the regulator to the new IDA. But actually, increasingly, it will also be measured by two other things. I think it will be measured by reactive engagement from the regulator. So I think, you know, people are getting much wiser about expectations. People are getting much clearer how to complain and how to make voices heard. And in fact, we're obligated to listen to people who might not just be shouting. So we're obligated to reach out to people who maybe haven't engaged with. And you know, there is staggering data on this. There are tenants and customers living in homes for 10 years that we've never heard from once. You know, they are literally, you know, that's, so how do you know what those tenants and customers' needs are? Just because we haven't heard from them, don't mean we can assume it's okay. But I think that the fourth area then, so there's reactive engagement then, where the regulator will be measuring and judging. And then I think the final and perhaps most powerful area where we'll be measured will be in the sentiment of our tenants and customers, which will also be played out in the media. So whether we like it or not, whether it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, whether we think there are things driving things that aren't necessarily 100% accurate, we will live or die, I believe, by how we're perceived by our customers as a collective, and also how it's played out in the media. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. But yes, there are formal methods for monitoring and regulating the new consumer standard, and that's why the regulators invested heavily in more resources and more specialists.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for that. Just circling back at a question from us, really. We obviously hear kind of, and you've already spoken about this a little bit, but one of the key blockers and challenges is that data, and obviously the data underpinning some of the changes that we want to make. Organizations are kind of sometimes unable to segment data or stock into buckets in order to kind of focus on service delivery or comms, but and that's often due to the age of the data. So if you were a housing association in that position, where would you begin in terms of that prioritization?
I think what I'd do first of all is I'd look at what I have got. So I'd say, okay, what have I got? Right, I've probably got fairly decent complaints. I've probably got some basic stock condition data. I've probably got data on responsive repairs, and I would look at that data and tell me what it was telling me, and then I would test that against my gut, and I would also test it against focus groups. So I'd get together with groups of tenants who are representative across the organisation to, in effect, create, I suppose it's like a hypothesis in theory terms. It's saying, right, roughly we think our sentiment sits here. The TSMs have been measured and they told us this, this and this. That's pretty much what we're feeling from a service perspective, and this is what our data is telling us. And then I'd look for those points of data misalignment, and I'd probably do some data quality work to validate, to test, and that will require investment. You know, you probably will need, you know, whether it's us coming in as Prodo to do, we're doing this with loads of organisations now actually, and it's absolutely in the category of readiness. In fact, Liv and I have got a meeting tomorrow actually with one where, you know, we're doing this really short, sharp, very laser-like focused piece of heavy lifting on discovery, on saying, right, okay, what are we hearing? What are we seeing? What's the information telling us? Are we getting enough people interacting with us to know that what we've got is accurate? So I think there's no substitute for investing in that short, sharp, laser-like focus. And in some ways, that's easier than investing in some giant monolithic tech improvement, because it's never only about tech. It's always about tech, it's always about process, and it's always about culture. And you need all three of those things to make it effective. So I would say that, you know, there isn't a substitute for the heavy lifting, but you can use, if you bring people together, your existing data reference points to give you a good start while you're working on data quality.
Do we have time for one more, Jake, or is that?
You could probably squeeze one more in if you've got another one.
So that's a short answer from me then, Liv. Go on then. Short question, short answer.
Thank you. So last one, kind of tied to the question around how it'll be measured. Will there be elements of that standard that mean that tenants will have to give the option to report things or hear their voice to adjust the delivery off the back of those standards? So how are associations balancing customer access in terms of digital versus non-digital when gaining that feedback? Right.
I mean, I think the answer is you need customer choice. So you need to be clear what people can access, what people's preferences and needs are, and then you need to make sure through all of your channels you're capturing that feedback. And I think there is a bit of a silver bullet here, but it's not as easy as it sounds in theory. So the silver bullet is all of those interaction points, whether it's somebody going to service a boiler or somebody, if we could capture sentiment and need at every single point of interaction, we would really accelerate hearing that voice. And I think that's the key. We've got to embed a philosophy across the whole organisation in every single role of we need to understand customers' needs, preferences and sentiment and establish customer sentiment. And if we could nail that, we'd have a really big head start on this.
Yeah, definitely,
Absolutely.
definitely agree with that one.
Excellent. Okay, well, that was brilliant. Thank you very much for the questions, and those of you who sent those through before the call as well. And again, Amanda, for that insightful sort of overview and answer those questions in such an eloquent way as well. So thank you for that. But I suppose finally, just from us, it is a big topic, this, and obviously we've been through the context in quite a bit of detail today, but also some of the points around the 4 standards and maybe where to look first. And Amanda mentioned at the start, we did run a survey at the end of last year around readiness for this, which we will be doing again, and be looking to address quite a similar topic, really, in terms of what those surveys are saying across the space in terms of readiness with our client base and with our contacts across the sector, and sort of delving into that on the next Housing Hive as well. But yeah, as you put it, Amanda, it's one of those, isn't it, where it feels like there's a hell of a lot to go at here. The need of it and purpose of it is really clear, and it feels like it probably always should have been there, but it does take a long time to sort of become regulatory. But yeah, again, we're sort of running these sort of short, sharp discovery pieces, as Amanda says, with lots of organisations at the moment. So if that is something you're interested in sort of exploring with us further, yeah, just drop us a note and we can sort of pick that up. But yeah, just to finish, we just wanted to really thank you for your time, Amanda, today. I know you're having a very busy day today yourself, so thank you very much for taking the time to join us and sort of prep for this with us.
No problem.
And yourself as well, Liv, just for sort of addressing those questions, and everyone who's attended as well today. It was excellent. So hopefully we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. I mean, lovely to meet you
Cool.
all. And if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn or anything, I'd be happy to take any questions afterwards. So lovely to see you all. Thank you. And thanks, Jake and Liv.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Enjoy your day.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.